This is a desk that I built in exactly 3 hours just after my daughter was born because I was desperate. She turns 2 next week, and I think my living room deserves something better. Fortunately, Sam over at Gumtree Woodworks is running the Scrapwood Build-Off again, the Australia-New Zealand version. Check out Turgworks for the UK version. And that seemed like a perfect excuse to give some bling to the old workhorse. Now, of course, the original desk was made of bed slats and a piece of melamine that I got from the gutter, so we would have to continue that theme as it's also part of the challenge conditions, and we're going to use all reclaimed materials. There were several things that I wanted to do to this desk, having lived with it for nearly 2 years. The first was there was an ever so slight sag starting in the melamine top, so a little bit of bracing on the front and back would help to rectify that problem. These would be made out of some Bedslat offcuts, but that was the nasty stuff. For the next stage, I wanted to add some functional shoe storage to stop us from dumping all of our footwear just inside the door and being tripped over. With a toddler in the house, we now have more shoes and they need somewhere to go. So I dug into my secret treasure chest of the good bed slats and pulled out the nicest ones I could find. I even got some nice high contrast artsy shots of me selecting the faces and marking which ones would be up. And then hopefully remembering when I pocket hold to put those on the correct downside so the clearer face would be showing. While yes, the goal of this is to ultimately jazz up and bling the desk, we're not going crazy. There's only so much you can do with a turd, and while I will be applying a liberal amount of polish, I am still using pine and pocket holes. Most of these won't be seen. One of the things I love about these corner Kreg clamps is that they've got that cutout so that you can put your pocket hole screw in the corner on without removing the clamp. That's a nifty little feature. But then again, they also cost 5 times more than other corner clamps, so you gotta have some wins somewhere. The carcass of the shoe rack will also serve to stiffen up the frame a little bit, as there was quite a lot of wobble in there, and it was snug as a bug in a rug on the side that would be displayed. Now I just have to work out the spacing for my shelf holes. And the easiest way to do that is to jam in the middle divider, measure the difference, and divide by 2. A quick little cameo from the toddler in question, as the grandparents take her out for an evening walk. And Daddy bashes away on the pocket hole jig, and then literally bashes away on getting these super snug fitting pieces into some sort of order. Whenever I'm doing spaced shelves like this, I like to use offcuts, not only to hold up the shelves, but to ensure that your spacing is even. I had this weird little gap at the back thing, so I just made a half lap piece to jam in there and cover that up. This is the back, and as Steve Ramsey likes to say, put the crappy side against the wall. No one will see that. This is the front, and it also looks crappy, so we're going to have to do something to cover up that nonsense. But first, stage 2 was complete, with a bit of rough planing to smooth things out in preparation for stage 3. The shoe rack was done. Now it is time to get classier. Well, classy-ish anyway. This is teak, reclaimed teak specifically,
Look at that.
that I've had kicking around for quite a while, having pulled it off as unsalvageable for the repair of many, many benches that I did a couple of years ago. But I thought that underneath all of that grime, grub, and weather, there could be some gold.
Or we could use these, which are actual lovely teak. Yeah, let's try to avoid that. So oily.
So let's see what we can scrap out of these leftover bench slats. I'll link to that old video if you'd like to check it out. If you are going to be working with reclaimed materials of any type, particularly things that used to have metal fasteners in them, then a metal detector is invaluable. Check around those screw holes, but basically everywhere, to make sure you're not going to stuff up your blades. No jointer, so I simply ran the long pieces through the table saw, took off one edge, flipped them, and then took off the opposite edge. And this material would serve as the trim and cladding for my scrapwood desk. Luckily I remembered that this little edging piece that I put on to cover the ugly melamine had some pin nails in it, and I smacked those deep in before I used the flush trim router to get rid of them. But not only are the edges of the melamine ugly, but the melamine itself is terrible. Luckily, I had this score. Well now, what do we have here? Tempting, yes. I'll turn you upside down. That is 4mm hardwood ply. And there are 2 complete sheets. In nearly perfect condition. In the rubbish. How the hell do I get those home? The answer is a box cutter, which works surprisingly well to cut them roughly in half, and then the next day you bring your Kreg panel carrier in, you haul ass through the busiest park in Sydney, followed by peak hour on the metro, and that's how you get your sheets of plywood home. Luckily they're only 4mm because they were bloody heavy. Then Chopper Chris can join the party and help you trim those pieces down to size in both dimensions to make the new top for your desk. That will look much prettier. Whenever you are working with scrap, particularly when you're trying to alter something, never work in exact dimensions. You'll notice that in every step of the operation here, I always make things oversized, then I stick them down, and then I trim them to fit the actual dimensions of my desk. Because nothing is square and everything has got slight bends and warps and twists in it, you're going to get a better result than if you were making it from scratch, where you can make it to exact dimensions. Now, of course, I do have my own challenge going on at the moment, the Chappo Challenge 25, and that lovely piece of red gum will be the feature of my next video. But I wanted to get the scrapwood one out of the way. Ironically, my own challenge, which motivates you to get back in your workshop if you've been on a hiatus and film some new videos, is going to be a butt-ton simpler than this particular build, which I decided to get done first because I need my desk to edit on. And here I am putting my own advice into practice using the flush trim bit to make sure the new plywood top perfectly matches the old underbelly of the ugly desk. Now it's time to break out the teak, and of course there is going to be a lot of character, in inverted commas, in any piece of reclaimed wood, particularly stuff that has been sitting out in the wilderness for 30-ish years. I think these bench seats had been out there, and honestly, for that age, it shows you how well teak is suited to outdoor furniture. It was holding up pretty good. But there were some very deep pits, voids, weathering and soft spots which I simply can't avoid, and while I chose the best bits, I had to live with a few of the deformities. I really should elevate a thickness planer to the top of my wish list, because having to plan these down by hand, let's just say it was lucky my 3-inch hand plane was able to not leave any train tracks in this particular instance, and the number 5 was able to clean up the small imperfections. But after mitring them, I didn't want the boring face. I wanted some form of detail, and I settled on this pointy, stabby, sharpie type bit for the router. By setting it up on the table, I was able to cut first one and then flip the board over and cut a second to give this lovely little double chamfer detail. And if you know me, I love me a chamfer, and so I thought this would be suitable. While I could avoid some of the old screw holes, I couldn't avoid all of them, and I needed a way to easily attach these trim pieces around the edge of the desk, so I decided to run with it instead of trying to hide them. I drilled out the old ones, but then I also spaced my screws in an aesthetically pleasing way so that they look like they were part of the design. Then I could plug them all up, and what was a flaw in the reclaimed material now becomes a feature of the piece. Because I have a bee's dick worth of good hardwood on top of that piece of ply that I will most likely sand through at some stage, I had to be very precise with the alignment of this trim. So putting a straight edge along the top allowed me to get that almost perfect. And because the crappy side will go against the wall, the mitre was incredibly easy because I only needed 3 sides, not 4. And that only left me with the smallest of gaps from the slight variation in thicknesses from my trim pieces. Notice in the front there, just a quick little repair with some super glue of the corner which didn't have quite enough glue on it to begin with. Breaking out the micro files, just dealt with some slight misalignment in my profiles. But honestly, you'd never know. Well, I'll never know, but you know because you saw me do it, but anyone else is not going to notice, and that's the important part. And now I think I cheat, because I do believe, though this is scrap, I actually paid for this piece of Tasmanian oak. Now, it is an offcut of another project, but, well, you got to pay for some bits, I suppose. And these plugs, I hoped, were going to match the colour of the plywood top. In Australia, when something says hardwood and it's a generic big box store product, you can pretty much guarantee it's going to be Vic Ash / Tassie Oak of some description. I tried-ish to align the grain, but the grain on the teak wasn't exactly straight anyway. But getting these plugs nicely spaced out and kind of facing the right direction was a handy little feature. Unfortunately, just due to some rotten things, there were some gaps, and I was in 2 minds about breaking out the bog. At the end, I decided to do it, and it was the right decision, but as I feared, I did start to go through, when I was sanding it off, the hardwood very thin veneer, and it got a bit of dark colour around some of the edges, but with the overall rustic feel of this desk, it just adds to a little bit more character. Once the plugs were dry, I could use the flush trim saw just to trim those back and then get into sanding off the bog. Look, it came out nice and it's better than it would have been without it, but yeah. If I had more time, I would have thought of another way to do that. About halfway through this build, I went down to Melbourne for the annual 2025 Maker Meetup, this time number 5.
First time, of course that was going to happen.
Hello.
Baby bomb. You're going on the internet again. Not supposed to be doing that.
And while I was there, my friend Vipun decided that he would give me this sexy piece of kit. He bought it for his saw and then realised that the kerf was in fact too thin for his riving knife and it kept jamming up. He did a quick Google and realised it was the perfect size for my little CTS. And it is a very welcome gift because I've been using the stock rip blade for everything, and particularly with this very fine plywood, having the multi-tooth blade was a big step up. So more of the plywood that we used for the top was now going to be used to hide up some of the ugly bed slats. Yes, I'm using garbage to cover up garbage, but this is slightly nicer garbage. and I wasn't going to be too precious about it, even with the crane direction on this particular piece, as Presto the nail gun comes out to help me tack it all down nice and fast. I could have done more with this. There are some exposed pine edges which I just left. Some of them I regret, some of them I don't. But you got to call it a day somewhere, and at the end of the day, this is my desk, and only I'm going to notice those differences, and I've only got so much time to dedicate to the build. Just pick your battles.
Hey, what? Getting better.
In the end, the cladding of all of the pine bits that I did clad was one of the easier and more straightforward parts. But it did leave me with some, as always, exposed plywood edges, and that's not ideal. We'll deal with those later. But first, it is on to the main event. This part was actually inspired by Deano Builds, who is currently hauling all of his gear halfway across the country, actually all the way across the country from WA to Victoria. But while he was still in WA, he made an outdoor kitchen where he used some hardwood cladding, which he put profiles on all of the edges and I think looked pretty schmick. His was a lot more detailed than what I'm going to do here, but to avoid having a flat teak face, I do want to do something similar. Unfortunately, after I resawed down my teak, firstly to get a nice clean face, and secondly because I didn't have enough left, and thirdly because it was too thick and would look crap if I didn't, I needed to add, guessy, another chamfer all the things along all the edges. A quick note, do be cautious of doing resawing on your table saw. These pieces are not too thick, so it was possible. Set up a feather board and do it in 2 cuts, flipping end over end, and you should get some acceptable results that can be cleaned up with a little bit of hand playing action. But back to the edge profiling, it ended up that they were too thin to safely put through the chamfer bit on the router table. And there weren't too many to do, so instead I broke out the block plane, and while it wouldn't be as even or consistent, this is a feature. It's meant to draw the eye, and it's meant to hide the gaps between my poorly edge-jointed boards, so having a bit of inconsistency here is not the end of the world. And sometimes it is just really pleasant to take off the hearing protection and get some hand tool action going in the shop. And that's what we end up with, and I think it is quite lovely. Thank you, Deano, for the idea. The skinnier leg just got 2 pieces, which again are oversized. They're overhanging that plywood just a little bit. And no mechanical fasteners this time. I just wanted the glue, so we didn't introduce any nail holes into the show faces. The sides around the shoe cavities got the same treatment. I didn't add any new holes to these, but there were some existing plugs that needed to be bashed on in, and I tried to position those in even-ish locations so they too would become little features of their own. And then it was time for the main event, which required 2 very thin pieces of stock to be ripped. So it would be advantageous to break out for the first time my thin stock ripping jig that Anthony from Barber's Paddock was very kind to donate. This was one of his prototypes, which he even personalised for me, which is very lovely. And if you pop over to his website, you can get the final version now. So you can see here, you install it, touch it up against the blade, zero off the digital calipers, and then I could use those to very accurately dial in the exact thickness of the piece that I wanted. The advantage of a thin stock ripping jig is that you have more space between the blade and the fence, and then you wheel the fence in, touching the stock up, and that bearing wheel helps you maintain a consistent thickness of pieces, and if you run out of stock or it gets too thin, you can simply wind the fence out and start all over again. I only needed 2 pieces, but you can imagine if you were cutting heaps of these, how much time this is going to save you and how much safer it is than doing it with a very narrow gap in the fence there. So thank you very much, Anthony, and go check out Barber's Paddock. He does some amazing mad scientist thing with woodworking gear. And this was the final result. After carefully hand chamfering all the edges, I left myself almost no gluing surface. But to keep this all aligned, I wanted to at least make an attempt to glue this up. So copying something I saw on Paul the Wood Knight's channel, I made myself this clamping jig using my MFT. Honestly, I just keep finding more and more ways to use this bench. It's one of my favourite things that I have built. Cough cough, check out my link below where you can buy plans to make it yourself if you so wish. Broke out the Chappo post again to weigh down this monstrosity, and while that dried, I could attend to some small jobs that included more hand tool work. Honestly, while I am and always will be a power tool guy, I do get much satisfaction from those little times when I can break out a nice sharp chisel. While waiting for the glue, we got firstly the flush trim bit out. As I said, I cut all those teak bits slightly oversized. And then when it matched the profile, I could get my tiny chamfer bit and run that all the way around the outsides as well. The only disadvantage of doing this after I had glued on was that it left these little lamb's tongues at the top where the router couldn't get close enough, but that again gave me another opportunity to break out a lovely sharp chisel and practice my hand tool usage, which is getting better, ever so slowly. Which is nice because these are very satisfying little fun jobs. Breaking the main panel out, and straight away I knew I was in trouble because firstly I hadn't left it long enough, and secondly the surface area
it's still not dry.
was probably far too small for a successful glue up anyway, but it didn't matter, it held it tight enough and all of the back of it would be covered in glue and many clamps. And if you look closely, you'll see that surprise that I managed to get a cheeky bookmark from resawing some of the teak. And again, while waiting for glue, there are more jobs to be done. And look, this isn't the safest thing that I have done on the table saw, but it was better than the router because small bits and routers are not friends. And this was relatively controlled, as it wasn't a through cut, and it allowed me to rebate out enough of the wood that I could clean it up with sandpaper and hide those ugly plywood edges. Again, I didn't do all of them, I could have done more, but it was diminishing return situation. Before I glued them on though, I quickly filled in, just with glue and sawdust, some of the pinhead nail holes. And then as all my clamps were busy, I had to rely on the blue tape trick to hold the trim in place, which I was far too stingy with, but it worked.
It looks pretty stormy.
The finish line was finally in sight, but then you remember you still have a lot of sanding to do. A lot of sanding, like heaps of sanding. And some boo-boos to fix up. I knew this was here, I knew I had to plane down that bottom foot that was sticking out a little bit or it would hold it proud, and in my excitement I simply forgot. So some teak wedges to the rescue, and a quick thwacker with Jimmy the fake maker's mallet. And my little cheeky block plane gave me an acceptable result. There are gaps all over this thing, it was just the really biggest ones that I wanted to try and hide. The final bit of power tool work is always a very happy part of the build. Just quickly going over and coming back on the end grain so as not to tear it out. And then I had this problem. I wanted to put a chamfer on that very thin trim, so I got a piece of stock that was the same thickness, blue tape trick super glued it to the base of the router, and that gave me a much more stable platform with which to add the final little detail to this outside trim area. Beautiful. But that of course left me with a few more little lamb's tongues just to clean up. And now, enter the Sandman. I wish I could afford to pay for that song. As we sanded with a soft pad, we sanded with hard sticks. We got the blower out just to clean up all of that dust, and then we sanded some more. In terms of the legs, I took those to 120. Used a block plane to very gently break over the sharp edges, but I didn't want a chamfer along the top there. And then Kevin the Sander's main event was taking the top to 320. Desperately trying to not go through that ultra thin hardwood veneer. But we got there in the end, and it was finally time to finish. With something new to me, hard wax oil. I bought this sample pot of Fitties ages ago, and I finally have the project that is suitable to use it on. I was told that a little went a long way, but honestly I found that this thirsty plywood, a lot needed to go a long way. I would only just get through the project with this tin, and that was using the hard wax oil on the teak faces and the top only. The rest of the pine and plywood underneath, I had to resort to Danish oil, which honestly was probably a better choice. Non-wearable surfaces, it just soaks in much faster and much easier. And I finished that tin too. I love a project that uses up not only scraps of wood, but scraps of finish. In a lot of ways, Danish oil and hard wax oil are both very similar in how that they work. They got just slightly different components. There's a bit of poly in the Danish, but together you couldn't tell which was used on which surface. And then, as always, my final finishing step is to break out the Scotty Custom Grit Step 1 and Step 2 for the show faces. Soft buffing pad with the Step 1, particularly on the top and the teak, and then wipe all of that off, switch over pads to my orange one, and the Step 2 buffs it up to a beautiful shine. Clean rag to take off all of the grit, and then we finish it off with the custom grit wax, which you're meant to use in sparing amounts, but I never read that part. I just get a brand new sheet and then polish it back, and you can already see the mirror-like shine on that beautiful piece of feature that I was able to uncover when book matching out the teak. And ladies and gentlemen, my crappy 3-hour desk is now about a 25-hour desk, but damn does she look much prettier. Rustic, yes. Completely out of character in style with everything else in our living room, yes. But I don't care, I love it. And what was a knockdown piece of furniture more suited to a university dorm room has been successfully transformed into a functional, practical, dare I say, mildly artistic piece of fine-er scrapwood junk furniture. And I even got a little piece of offcut to stick onto the memory wall. One challenge down, Chappo challenge to go. I'll see you in a week or two for that. James out. I hope you enjoyed the build.